Witness the bloodiest chapters of history.
In the summer of 1942, the streets of Stalingrad echoed with distant thunder. But it wasn't rain, it was German artillery. Thousands of shells crashed into homes, hospitals, schools, ripping flesh from bone, blasting walls into dust. By nightfall, the city burned orange. By morning, it was a skeleton of smoke. Operation Blue had begun. Hitler's goal was simple: reach the oil fields of the Caucasus. But to get there, he needed to seize the city that carried his rival's name, Stalingrad. A victory here would be more than strategic. It would humiliate Stalin himself. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. Bombers roared overhead. Buildings vaporized. Families vanished in firestorms. In one day, over 40,000 civilians were killed. Charred bodies lay fused to pavement. Mothers held children turned to ash. General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army marched through the wreckage. What they found wasn't a city. It was a graveyard. But the Soviets didn't run. They burrowed. They fought from sewers, factories, basements, rats crawling beside them. Steel met bone. Grenades exploded inches apart. Knives replaced bullets. And no one was safe. German troops called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Snipers struck from shadows. Molotovs rained from shattered windows. A single building could take a week to capture. And even then, it might fall again by morning. Inside the Red October factory, soldiers drowned in their own blood while trying to cross halls strewn with limbs. Frozen corpses piled like sandbags. Ammunition was passed hand to hand because supply chains no longer existed. Rivers ran red, and the rats ate well. The Volga River, lifeline of the city, became a corridor of death. Soviet boats crossed under constant bombardment. Those on deck were shredded by machine gun fire. Those who survived found no shelter. Only ruin. Only death. And still, Stalin's order echoed. Not one step back. Tens of thousands obeyed and died. Entire battalions vanished within hours. Frost-bitten boys with no rifles charged tanks. Wounded were buried alive in collapsed bunkers. This was no longer war. This was slaughter on an industrial scale. And it had just begun. The sun scorched the dry soil of southern Russia as Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army pressed eastward toward the Volga. The city of Stalingrad loomed ahead, gray, industrial, and defiant. German commanders believed they were on the verge of final victory, but what awaited them was not conquest, it was damnation. By mid-August 1942, the Luftwaffe began Operation Fischreier, a merciless bombing campaign designed to cripple Stalingrad before a single German soldier stepped foot inside. The sky over the city turned black with smoke. Bombs rained down in waves. Houses, factories, and schools were obliterated. Firestorms roared through neighborhoods, sucking the oxygen from the air. Civilians suffocated before the flames reached them. Over 40,000 civilians died in the first week alone. But the Soviets did not break. Instead, they dug in deeper. Entire neighborhoods transformed into strongholds. Workers from tractor factories picked up rifles and grenades and joined the Red Army. Women sewed camouflage nets, while artillerymen fired day and night. This was no ordinary battle. This was a holy war for survival. German panzer divisions rolled into the outskirts by late August. What they saw was not a broken city. It was a city turned into a fortress of ruin. Every house became a bunker. Every basement a sniper nest. every sewer a tunnel for ambush. The fighting turned savage. Soldiers no longer fought for kilometers or blocks, but for individual rooms, stairwells, and piles of rubble. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. The Red House, the grain elevator, the railway station. These names became infamous among the Wehrmacht. A single building could cost hundreds of lives. The Soviets would hold the ground during the day, get bombarded at night, and counterattack at dawn. One infamous location, the grain elevator, was held by a mere 40 Soviet soldiers against waves of tanks and infantry for 4 days straight. When the Germans finally took the building, they found the defenders burned, bayoneted, and still clutching their weapons in death. Meanwhile, on the Volga's eastern bank, General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, barked orders from a sandbag-covered bunker. His command was simple: there is no land beyond the Volga. Soldiers knew what that meant. Retreat was suicide, victory or death. The Germans, confident in their discipline and technology, soon found themselves in a nightmare. Flamethrowers turned bunkers into crematoriums. Grenades bounced down stairwells every minute. Molotov cocktails lit tanks on fire like candles. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev picked off officers from rooftops and chimneys. His kill count climbed into the hundreds. As September dragged on, temperatures began to drop. The ruins of the city grew colder, sharper, deadlier. Bodies froze in grotesque shapes. Rats feasted on corpses. Ammunition ran low. Morale plummeted. But Hitler demanded more. Stalingrad must fall. To break the deadlock, Paulus launched massive assaults on Mamiev Kurgan, the strategic hill overlooking the city. The battle for that hill alone would cost tens of thousands of lives. Soldiers charged uphill through shell fire, only to be blown back by mortars and machine guns. The soil turned red, then black, then mud, then frozen flesh. Inside the city, hand-to-hand combat became the norm. Entrenching tools replaced rifles. Bricks became weapons. Some units were reduced to fighting with bare hands, their weapons lost in rubble or frozen in the cold. Screams echoed through sewer tunnels. Men killed for water, for boots, for a single cigarette. And still, the Volga kept flowing, a lifeline of reinforcements and hope. Even as artillery shells turned ferries to splinters, Soviet reinforcements continued to cross under fire, clinging to rafts, ice, or corpses to reach the West Bank. Many were 17-year-old boys. Some lasted less than an hour. By the end of September, the Germans controlled most of Stalingrad, but not all. The Soviets clung to the riverbank, holding on like a wounded beast refusing to die. Stalin himself ordered, "Not a step back." And so the fighting continued, more brutal, more desperate. What began as a blitzkrieg had become a slow, bleeding death, not just of armies, but of hope. The German 6th Army didn't realize it yet, but with every building they seized, every soldier they lost, they were being pulled deeper into the jaws of the bear. The trap was being set. The Soviets had bled, burned, and sacrificed. Now, they were about to strike back. The wind began to howl across the shattered city. October arrived, and with it came the bitter breath of the Russian steppe. Temperatures plunged. The Volga began to freeze. Blood turned to slush. Guns jammed. Flesh stuck to metal. But the battle raged on. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the lines between man and beast blurred. German soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains, tablecloths, anything they could rip from the ruins. Soviet troops buried themselves in ash and rubble to stay warm. The dead were no longer buried. They were used as sandbags, shields, even insulation. The fighting had lost all sense of structure. Entire platoons disappeared in the fog. Soldiers went mad, talking to ghosts, eating wallpaper soaked in paste for calories. Some units were trapped in cellars for days, surviving on melted snow and the flesh of comrades who died first. Above them, Soviet artillery never slept. From the far bank of the Volga, thousands of guns unleashed hell each night. Fire fell like rain. Whole blocks disappeared. The Germans dug deeper, creating underground shelters, but even steel beams snapped under the bombardment. And yet, the Sixth Army pushed forward. Hitler's orders were clear: take Stalingrad at all costs. But cost was all the Wehrmacht was paying. Thousands died every week, for meters of progress. In desperation, the Germans turned to terror. Incendiary bombs, flamethrowers, and gas grenades were used to clear buildings. Soviet defenders suffocated or burned alive. But the Red Army only grew more enraged. In October, Stalin sent his infamous order once more: Ni shagu nazad. Not one step back. Soviet reinforcements, raw, untrained, often unarmed, continued to pour across the frozen Volga. Some were handed rifles only after the man in front died. Others were ordered to charge German lines with shovels, bricks, or broken bottles. Those who fled were shot by their own commanders, but still, they fought. In the heart of the ruins, sniper duels reached mythic status. Vasily Zaitsev hunted officers from smokestacks and sewer grates. The Germans sent their own elite marksmen to kill him. The snipers played chess with death. One breath, one twitch, one heartbeat out of sync meant the end. Meanwhile, General Paulus's army was stretched to the breaking point. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies vanished. Entire battalions were reduced to half strength. Disease, frostbite, and despair took hold. The once mighty Wehrmacht was turning into a skeleton army. Behind enemy lines, the Soviets were not idle. Stalin and his generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, were planning a storm. A counterstrike unlike anything the Germans had seen. An operation that would not merely push back, but encircle and destroy. Codenamed Operation Uranus, it would strike not at Stalingrad itself, but at its flanks. The Germans had stationed under-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions to guard the rear. They were poorly armed, poorly trained, and unprepared for the frozen hell awaiting them. By late November, Soviet troops had quietly amassed in secret. Tanks were hidden in forests. Troops were camouflaged in white. Artillery pieces were dug into frozen earth. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers stood ready, waiting for the signal. And then, November 19th, 1942. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the earth shook. Over 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire in unison. The Romanian lines were shredded. Panic spread like wildfire. Soviet tanks burst through the snow, rolling over trenches and frozen corpses. Infantry followed, stabbing and gunning through the chaos. The Germans were caught off guard. They believed winter would bring a pause in fighting. They were wrong. The Soviets had become winter itself. By November 23rd, just 4 days later, the unthinkable happened. The two Soviet pincers linked up near the town of Kalash. The entire German Sixth Army was surrounded. Over 300,000 Axis troops were now trapped in Stalingrad. Their supply lines severed, their fate sealed. The trap had snapped shut. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He ordered Paulus to hold position. There would be no breakout, no retreat. The Luftwaffe was commanded to supply the army by air, promising to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. They never came close. Most days, they delivered less than 90 tons, barely enough for a single division. Inside the pocket, called the Kessel or Cauldron, conditions deteriorated fast. Men fought over frozen bread. Horses were slaughtered for food. Frostbite blackened limbs. Ammunition dwindled. Cannibalism began to appear in whispers, and yet Paulus obeyed. The Sixth Army remained. In Stalingrad, the Soviets knew the tide had turned. The defenders, who once clung to the riverbank, now pressed outward. Soviet forces tightened the noose. Day by day, street by street, ruin by ruin. Stalingrad was no longer a battleground. It had become a graveyard of armies. And winter had only just begun. Trapped, surrounded, forgotten. By early December, the German Sixth Army had become prisoners of their own Führer's arrogance. Over 300,000 men were now crammed into the Kessel, a frozen pocket of death around Stalingrad. The once mighty force that marched across Russia now shivered in cellars, scavenging for food and hope. There was no food. There was no hope. Temperatures fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers woke up with frozen urine in their boots. Weapons froze, blood froze, time froze. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Wounded men lay side by side with the dead, moaning, coughing, begging for morphine that no longer existed. Some were buried alive when buildings collapsed. Others were left outside, naked, screaming, turning to statues. The Luftwaffe, tasked with supplying the trapped army by air, had failed spectacularly. Every cargo plane was met with flak, snowstorms, and Soviet fighters. Most never reached their destination. The few that did were loaded with useless supplies, condoms, summer uniforms, typewriters. Not food, not ammo, not fuel. Inside the Kessel, madness took hold. German soldiers roasted book pages and horse bones to chew. Some units began eating rats. Others hunted stray dogs. Then, men. Eyewitness accounts tell of human meat cooked in helmets, of legs severed not for surgery, but survival. The line between soldier and animal was gone. General Paulus, trapped in the city center, sat in silence. His orders were clear. Stand fast. No surrender. No retreat. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal, the highest military rank in Germany, and reminded him no German Field Marshal has ever been captured alive. It was a death sentence dressed as honor. Meanwhile, Soviet troops outside the pocket tightened the noose. Entire divisions moved with clockwork precision. Katyusha rockets lit up the sky. Artillery thundered day and night. Each day the Kessel shrank, block by block, trench by trench. In early January, Soviet forces launched Operation Ring, the final blow. Entire sectors of the German defense collapsed within hours. Some Wehrmacht units tried to surrender, only to be gunned down by their own officers. Others deserted, wandering aimlessly in the snow, calling for their mothers. Inside ruined factories, Germans fought with shovels, bricks, frozen rifle butts. Some had no ammo, no food, no shoes, just desperation. Soviet soldiers described entering bunkers where Germans sat quietly, eyes blank, waiting to die. And yet, the killing continued. The Soviets wanted total victory. No quarter was given. Buildings were cleared with flamethrowers and grenades. Bunkers were sealed with concrete and explosives. The Red Army had bled too much to show mercy. Paulus radioed Berlin. The situation is hopeless. Berlin responded, "Hold firm. Reinforcements are coming." There were no reinforcements. By January 22, 1943, over 100,000 German soldiers lay dead. Another 90,000 remained, starving, frostbitten, infected. Soviet loudspeakers broadcasted messages across the ruins. You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. You will be treated with dignity. Some obeyed. Others shot themselves. Entire platoons walked into Soviet lines with their hands raised, tears freezing on their cheeks. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. He was found in a cellar, pale, trembling, staring into space. He refused to kill himself, defying Hitler's final command. He would become the first German field marshal ever captured alive. The southern sector of the Kessel was gone. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the northern pocket fell. The battle was over. The numbers were staggering. 750,000 Axis soldiers had fought at Stalingrad. Over 400,000 were dead. Only around 5,000 German POWs would ever return home, after 10 years in Soviet camps. On the Soviet side, over 1.1 million casualties. But they had won. Stalingrad was rubble, a city of ash, bone, and blood. But it stood. Stalingrad had fallen, but not to the Germans. The Soviet flag now fluttered over a city of ghosts. Streets choked with rubble and corpses. Chimneys pierced the sky like broken fingers. Not a single building remained untouched by war. But through fire and frost, the Red Army had held. And now, they had won. The news of victory swept across the Soviet Union like a tidal wave of rebirth. Stalingrad has been saved. Those 4 words echoed through radio broadcasts, train stations, and village squares. Mothers wept. Factory workers cheered. Soldiers dug in on distant fronts stood a little taller. After months of retreat, humiliation, and death, the Soviet people finally had hope. And the world took notice. In Berlin, Hitler was silent for days. His dreams of crushing Bolshevism had been shattered in a frozen grave. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was no more. Over 300,000 Axis troops lost, entire divisions erased. The illusion of German invincibility had died in the ruins of Stalingrad. Worse, cracks began to form among Germany's allies. In Romania, in Hungary, in Italy, murmurs of doubt spread. Soldiers asked, "If Stalingrad fell, what chance do we have?" Meanwhile, in London and Washington, the mood shifted. Churchill declared, "Before Stalingrad, we had doubts. After Stalingrad, we have victory in our hands." Roosevelt sent a personal message to Stalin, calling the Soviet stand one of the greatest feats of arms in history. The Allies began to accelerate arms shipments through the Arctic convoys. American tanks, British trucks, and millions of tons of food and ammunition began pouring into the USSR. Stalingrad had changed the war, but it had also changed the Red Army. Before Stalingrad, the Soviets had fought to survive. After Stalingrad, they fought to win. In the spring of 1943, the Red Army reorganized, rearmed, and regained its confidence. Entire new armies were formed, filled with hardened veterans who had survived the inferno of the Volga. Commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev now had experience, discipline, and momentum. German generals, once bold and aggressive, began to hesitate. They had seen what the Soviets could endure, and now feared what they might unleash. Hitler, unwilling to admit defeat, ordered a counterstrike. Operation Citadel was conceived, a massive offensive targeting the Soviet salient at Kursk. It would be the largest tank battle in human history. But already, Soviet intelligence knew the plan. They had learned from Stalingrad to lure, to absorb, to destroy. Back in Stalingrad, the price of victory was everywhere. Tens of thousands of bodies remained frozen in collapsed buildings. Dogs fed on the dead. Survivors wandered the ruins, searching for relatives who would never return. The Volga, once red with blood, now flowed silent, as if mourning. The city's women began the work of rebuilding with bare hands and broken tools. Children helped clear bricks. Men with missing limbs stood guard at checkpoints. Soviet engineers marked unexploded shells buried in the rubble. Stalingrad was a city of the dead, being rebuilt by the barely living. Yet out of this devastation, a new kind of resistance was born, not just military, but spiritual. Stalingrad had proven one thing beyond doubt: the Nazis could be beaten. And that truth was more powerful than any tank, any gun, any order from Berlin. By July 1943, as the Germans prepared to strike at Kursk, the Soviets stood ready, not just to defend, but to push west, toward Ukraine, toward Poland, toward Berlin. What had started as a desperate defense along the Volga had become the beginning of Nazi Germany's end. The dust of Stalingrad had barely settled when the next storm began to form. Summer 1943. Hitler needed a miracle. After the crushing defeat at Stalingrad, Germany's prestige and morale had crumbled. But there was still hope in one last decisive strike, a bold plan, a hammer blow, Operation Citadel. The target, the Soviet-held city of Kursk, nestled inside a massive salient, a bulge in the front lines. Hitler believed that if he could pinch this bulge from both north and south, he could trap and destroy entire Soviet armies, reversing the tide of war. But the Soviets weren't blind anymore. They had learned. They were waiting. In the months before the attack, Stalin's spies fed every German plan to Moscow. Soviet engineers dug deep trenches, over 5,000 kilometers of them. They planted more than 1 million anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Artillery was dug into hillsides. Tank ambush points were camouflaged with deadly precision. Kursk was no city. It was a fortress the size of a country. By July, both sides had assembled the largest armies in human history. Germany, 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. Soviet Union, 1.9 million soldiers, 5,000 tanks, 25,000 artillery pieces. It was no longer a war between armies. It was a war between war machines. July 5th, 1943. Before the Germans could attack, the Soviets struck first, with a massive preemptive artillery bombardment. Shells rained down for hours, shaking the ground and crippling German command posts. Then came the tanks. In the north, German forces under Model slammed into dug-in Soviet defenses. Progress was slow. Casualties were high. Every meter was mined. Every tree concealed a gun. Entire armored columns were shredded by hidden artillery. In the south, General Hoth's panzer divisions pushed harder, led by the infamous SS Panzer Corps, boasting the newest weapon in Hitler's arsenal, the Tiger I Sievert, a beast of a machine, heavily armored, deadly at long range, but heavy, slow, vulnerable to mud, mines, and swarms. Soviet T-34s weren't as strong, but they were fast, reliable, and everywhere. And then came Prokhorovka, July 12, 1943. Outside the tiny village of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in human history erupted. Over 1,500 tanks clashed in fields soaked with morning dew and the stench of oil. There was no elegance, no strategy, just brutality. Tanks rammed each other, shells fired point blank. Crews climbed out to fight with pistols and grenades. Smoke blackened the sky. Steel screeched. Flames erupted from hatches. Entire battalions were incinerated in minutes. By nightfall, the field was a graveyard of metal. Both sides lost hundreds of tanks. But Germany had no reserves. The Soviets did. By mid-July, Operation Citadel collapsed. Hitler called off the offensive, the last major German attack on the Eastern Front. It had failed, completely. And Stalin, he didn't stop. The Red Army counterattacked, pushing west with relentless force. Orel fell, then Kharkov, then Smolensk. For the first time in the war, the Soviets had the initiative, and they would never give it back. The myth of German superiority, the blitzkrieg machine that had conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans, was now buried beneath fields of burning steel. Kursk marked more than just a Soviet victory. It marked the beginning of the end. From this point forward, Germany would only retreat, slowly, painfully, bleeding with every step. The Eastern Front had turned. The Red Army was coming, and it would not stop until the hammer and sickle flew over Berlin. The Red Army was no longer defending, it was hunting. By June 1944, the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front stretched thin, undermanned, under-equipped, and desperate. And Stalin saw the moment. While the Allies stormed Normandy, the Soviets unleashed a hurricane of steel in the east. Operation Bagration. On June 22nd, the anniversary of the German invasion of the USSR, over 2 million Soviet troops, 6,000 tanks, and 7,000 aircraft launched an all-out assault on German Army Group Center in Belarus. The result? Complete annihilation. Entire German divisions were crushed within days. Over 300,000 Axis troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Roads became rivers of burning trucks and shattered bodies. Forests echoed with screams. German command collapsed. Survivors called it the destruction of an army. Cities like Minsk, Vitebsk, and Bobruisk fell like dominoes. Soviet tanks thundered west. The Red Army didn't just breach the front, it shattered it. By August 1944, Stalin's forces reached the gates of Poland. The Vistula River became the new front line, but the Germans were broken. Warsaw rose up. The Polish Home Army revolted, hoping to be liberated, but the Soviets paused. Some say it was strategy. Some say it was revenge. While Warsaw burned under Nazi retaliation, the Red Army waited on the opposite bank, watching, silent. Winter came, and with it, the Soviets struck again. January 12, 1945. The Vistula-Oder offensive. It was no longer a war. It was an avalanche. In just 2 weeks, the Red Army advanced over 500 kilometers. Krakow, Łódź, and Poznan fell. The Germans fled west, leaving civilians, wounded, and charred towns behind. Hitler ordered resistance. No one listened. By the end of January, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The Nazi capital could now hear the thunder. Germany was collapsing, and the Red Army was at the gates. Spring had returned to Europe. But Berlin stood in ruins, its sky choked with smoke, its streets echoing with artillery. And from the east, the Red Army was coming. By April 1945, Germany was finished. The Wehrmacht was broken. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, but it was the Soviets who would take Berlin. Stalin insisted the final blow must come from the east. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 7,500 aircraft prepared to storm Hitler's capital. On April 16th, the Battle of Berlin began with the thunder of 20,000 artillery guns opening fire along the Oder River. It was the largest bombardment in history. The night sky turned red. Entire forests vanished. German positions disintegrated under the weight of fire. Facing them, teenagers, old men, the last defenders of the Reich, Volkssturm militias, Hitler youth battalions, broken Wehrmacht units, outnumbered, under-equipped, still ordered to fight to the death. Soviet forces broke through at Silo Heights, then surged west. Town by town, street by street, they tore through German lines. The advance was relentless. By April 21st, Soviet tanks reached Berlin's outer suburbs. Then, urban warfare began. The city turned into hell. Every block became a battlefield. Snipers in apartment windows, machine guns hidden in collapsed hospitals. Panzerfaust-wielding boys destroyed tanks from basements, only to be crushed by Soviet armor seconds later. The Red Army moved like a tide of fire and steel. Flamethrowers cleared buildings. Grenades rained into bunkers. Rockets streaked through apartment walls. Civilians screamed through smoke and dust, caught between loyalty, fear, and survival. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler remained in denial. His empire had collapsed. The SS had abandoned posts. His generals whispered surrender. But still, he clung to delusions of a counterattack. On April 29th, as Soviet shells exploded above, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in his bunker. One day later, they were both dead. Suicide. The body was burned in the garden above. The Third Reich was leaderless. The Nazi dream was ash. On May 2nd, after bitter final resistance, General Helmuth Weidling surrendered Berlin to Soviet forces. The red flag was raised above the Reichstag. The city had fallen. The cost? Over 80,000 Soviet soldiers killed hundreds of thousands, wounded 100,000 German military and civilian deaths. Berlin was not taken. It was consumed. And across the world, radios crackled with the same phrase. The war in Europe is over. The guns had fallen silent. But the echoes of Stalingrad still roared through history. Germany lay in ruins. Berlin was a graveyard of twisted iron and scorched stone. The Third Reich was no more. But the cost was almost beyond comprehension. Over 27 million Soviets dead. Cities reduced to ash. Generations of fathers, sons, and brothers gone. And at the center of it all, Stalingrad. It had begun as just another name on a map, but it became a symbol of horror, sacrifice, and endurance. The place where an army drowned in ice and fire, where fascism was broken by blood and will. For the survivors, peace brought no comfort. Soldiers returned to homes that no longer existed. Mothers buried sons with no graves. Entire towns were nothing but memory. But there was pride, because Stalingrad proved something more powerful than bullets. That a people could rise from the rubble, hold the line at the edge of the world, and turn the tide of history. In the decades that followed, the name Stalingrad echoed in textbooks, in speeches, in marble monuments, but it also lived in silence. In the eyes of veterans, in the nightmares of those who had seen too much. It reminded the world that victory has a price, that evil doesn't fall easily, and that sometimes salvation is bought with pain no one ever fully heals from. Stalingrad did not end the war, but it began the end. It was the pivot point, the moment where history broke and fate turned. And though the war ended in Berlin, its soul was buried in Stalingrad. The end. From the Volga to the Reichstag. From ashes to silence. This was the price of victory.
Witness the bloodiest chapters of history.